I'm not a man who believes in the supernatural. I work a 9 to 5 in the 30th floor office suite, surrounded by familiar, reliable representations of human ingenuity, steel and glass wall-to-wall carpeting. I deal in managing the personal holdings of those more successful than me, and am occasionally tossed a small raise by my disinterested boss. When the setting sun begins to bleed through my vertical shades, I ride the hermetically sealed elevator down to the parking garage, climb into my 2010 Honda Civic, and traverse the 25 miles to my 2-story house in the suburbs. For the past 30 years, my life has taken a predictable and comfortably tedious trajectory. Strange dreams, always half forgotten by morning, sometimes troubled by nights. But who among us doesn't have nightmares? My wife Elizabeth was supposed to drive Jenny to summer camp, but something at her work came up last minute, and so I found myself heading northwest on I-89. It was a Sunday and there were few other vehicles on the road. Though it was almost noon and the sun was high overhead, the trees and underbrush by the sides of the highway blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a solemn, almost foreboding atmosphere. My stepdaughter, nose buried in the book as usual, wasn't a natural conversationalist, and after a few attempts to engage her, I gave up and allowed myself to be lulled by the relentless chorus of the cicadas. I hadn't been in this part of the state since my early childhood, when my parents had rented a small weekend house deep in the Vermont woods. It isn't as though I actively avoided returning to the kingdom. I was simply a middle-aged, middle-class American whose solitary childhood imaginings belonged to the distant past, to the realm of make-believe, of half-remembered nightmares. And yet, there it was, the familiar dirt road winding into the forest. And then, almost unconsciously, I was slowing down, pulling off to the side of the road to a conveniently located rest stop. Jenny looked up from her book and regarded me with some trepidation. "It's all right," I reassured her. "We have plenty of time. I just want to show you the place where I used to spend my summers when I was around your age." It was my mother who first referred to our summer house and lands as our kingdom upon discovering the absolute remoteness of the spot. The nearest town was 30 minutes away by car. For a young child, we might as well have been living on the moon. The house itself was not spectacular. It was the surrounding land that was truly the kingdom. For 6 weeks, we lived in the middle of a pine forest. The trees grew so densely together that the sunlight was always odd and of a muted quality, distorting the shadows of things. Pine needles fell silently throughout the night, and we would awaken to find every surface covered by a thin layer of dried husks. The long days possessed an ephemeral quality, as if the true nature of the rocks and trees and streams was hidden behind a tin pane of glass. I knew deep in my bones, without ever being told, that we were only guests in the kingdom, that it truly belonged to the fairies. I'm not talking about simpering, bonneted caricatures that you find in sticker books. These fairies were part of the wild landscape, more essence than being. They made themselves known in the delicate lace of a dew adorning a spiderweb, and in the constant shifting and tumbling of the pine needles. I often swam in a small, pristine lake near our house, and when the normally balmy waters turned suddenly cold, I knew who was responsible. The fairies were capricious in their emotions and desires, and were enthralled to no one except the Fairy King. How strange it is that in recalling these ghosts of the past, I experienced the same feelings of wonder and fear that I did as a young boy. The Fairy King was ancient and powerful, and he lived in the palace. This was a small clearing within the thickest portion of the woods. It was ringed by immense trees, birch and dogwood as well as pines. At the center of the palace was a vernal pool, its surface vivid with green algae and vegetation. The Fairy King was owed special respect, and at the beginning and end of our visits to his kingdom, we paid him tribute so as to avoid his displeasure. By we, I mean Jack and I. There were a few other children whose families also summered in the kingdom, but he was my only true friend. Jack was a few years older than me, sturdy and red-cheeked, with haphazard hair and eyes the blue of a summer sky. People often remarked that we were like night and day. While Jack was boisterously cheerful, I was withdrawn, more inclined to lose myself in fantasy books or daydreams. But we were inseparable of one mind while racing through the woods or capturing frogs and bugs, and together we paid our respects to the fairies who deigned to let us roam freely through their lands. It was Jack who taught me how to construct the wreaths we provided as gifts, a flexible twig entwined and knotted with fragrant grasses. It was I who informed Jack that fairies were sometimes dragonflies by day, the size and color of the insect denoting the relative power of its true form. I was 8 years old during my last summer in the kingdom. My mother, never the most attentive of parents, was especially preoccupied with my 3-month-old brother, and my father was absent on one of his interminable business trips. The kingdom was the only place I could breathe freely, shed the daily mortifications bestowed by third-grade bullies, and the indifference of my family like an old snakeskin, with Jack by my side, of course. He and his family arrived the day after us. I was climbing a young pine tree when I glimpsed their familiar station wagon chugging up the dirt path into the settlement, the only road in or out. I scrambled down, bark scraping against my palms and knees, and raced to their house. I heard them before I saw them, voices raised in exasperation. Jack's father and mother were busily unpacking the car, turning occasionally to berate a hulking figure standing to the side. I couldn't see Jack. "You could at least give us a hand with your own suitcase," snapped Jack's mother at the strange person, as he snarled something in response. I realized that the kind-hearted boy I had loved like a brother had undergone a transformation. He was a little taller and thinner, but it was his face that had changed the most, settling into lines of boredom and contempt. I told myself that this could not be my friend. Jack, not Jack, was speaking to his father in a voice that matched his terrible new face. "Yeah, well, I didn't want to come, did I? Why couldn't I go rafting with Travis and Mike instead?" "Jack," replied his father wearily. They'd had this discussion before. "It's only 4 weeks. You'll make do." Then he saw me and brightened. "Hey, kiddo!" Jack looked at me, and his eyes were chips of ice. He said nothing to me, but heaved a great sigh and turned back to his father. "So I gotta make do with him? Thanks a lot." The father looked at his son in disgust, then turned back to the suitcases. Jack's mother gave me a brief grimace of pity. I couldn't have spoken had I wanted to. I stood there silently, very still, and convinced myself that when I looked up again, all would be restored to its rightful state. This hopeless reverie was broken by Jack, who with another gusty sigh turned and began roughly pushing his way through the branches. I followed him numbly through the woods. Where else could I go? Jack was heading towards the palace, and I realized that he either didn't know or didn't care. I had to run to keep up with his long strides, and the pine needles burned against my ankles. I almost lost him several times, and knew that he would not respond if I called out. By now, we were in the palace proper, and here Jack abruptly stopped and turned to face me. I could tell he was carefully arranging his face. "Listen," he said, the smile not quite reaching his eyes, arms out and palms up in a placating gesture. I recalled my father adopting the same semi-apologetic stance, as he explained to me that he'd have to miss my birthday for the 3rd time in a row. I hated him with a sudden passion. "Listen," Jack repeated. "It's not that you're okay and all, but all that kitty stuff, the fairy king and spells and whatever, you don't still believe in that, right? It's pretty dumb, right?" I think that up until that moment, I had held some desperate hope that the whole awful day could be mended, that we could forget the past and start anew, with the fairy king as witness. But at this final humiliation, something ugly and vindictive rose in me. I wanted to hurt him badly. "I don't know," I said. "You must be pretty dumb if Travis and Mike don't want to hang out with you." Something came undone in that cruel face, and Jack lunged at me and shoved me once, then again, and I tripped over a root and fell onto my back. Then he was on top of me, his features frozen in a rictus of fury. He clutched my throat and pulled his other arm back, hand clenched into a fist. I struggled and thrashed in vain. I was small for my age, and Jack must have been 20 pounds on me. He was panting and his words came out in vicious bursts. "You little shit! Yeah, you like the fairies? 'Cause you are one. You fucking fag!" I didn't know what the last word meant, but I imagined it to be something horrible from the way his face contorted as he spat it out. Suddenly his weight was off me, and I could breathe again. I had no time to collect my bearings before he was hauling me to my feet and marching forward at the same time, so I was forced to step backwards. "You want to see the fairies so bad? Okay, I'll help you see the fairies," he said. To my horror, I realized where we were heading. I began to twist madly and pull at his arms, apologizing and babbling. Jack was undeterred. I could feel the vernal pool lurking at my back, getting closer and closer, waiting to accept me in its watery embrace. The smell of it rose in the air all around, the scent of fresh grass and spicy sap, underlaid with dark tendrils of decay. He finally let go and my heels were only inches from the water. I wavered there at the edge of the pool, not daring to look behind me. Jack was a few feet away and now the smile on his face was genuine. He was enjoying himself. "Go for a swim!" he called happily. I tried to make a run for it, and the smile vanished. He came forward and pushed me again and I stumbled back. The scummy water closed over the tops of my sneakers, hot and thick and teeming with frenetic life. I was sobbing now unreservedly, and my tears seemed to aggravate Jack because he started shouting and pacing like a restless dog. In my fear and confusion I turned around, and then felt a sharp pain as a stone grazed my ear. I fell to my knees and the water splashed into my mouth and nose, and it was a living thing. A black panic overtook me, and I couldn't see anymore, and the stench of the pool filled my head, replacing my blood with a thick sludge and the air in my lungs with a rushing current. Then I was cradled in immense arms, and I looked up into the face of something both profoundly ancient and newborn, a something who had lived countless lives and to whom death was only a brief exaltation before the great inhale of birth. The inside of my eyelids was a soothing green, and I thought drowsily how pleasant it would be to drift forever, suspended in the timeless abyss. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the ground, twigs and roots digging into my body. Someone was whimpering and crying nearby. My eyes focused and I saw Jack a little distance away. He was trembling and groveling before someone or something I couldn't see. His eyes were very blue in his paper-white face. "Please, please," he was whining. "Please, I'm sorry. I'll be good. I promise." His voice sounded strange, almost sing-song, in stark contrast to the wild terror in his face. I felt it in the marrow of my bones before I heard it, a low thrumming all around us that was swiftly increasing in tone and intensity. Jack's pleas became faster and higher, and then his words began to run together until they dissolved into a miserable wailing. His mouth was stretched in a wide grin, but his eyes darted around frantically. His outline became fuzzy and vague, and I realized that every inch of his body was covered with flies. Only his insane eyes glared out from the swarm. He began to hop and skip, and I saw that he was dancing to some otherworldly rhythm, arms and legs twitching in a manic jig. He capered towards me, each movement punctuated by short screams and squeals, and as the fat flies doubled and tripled in number, Jack increased his tempo, arms and legs blaring with their awful burden. I threw my arms over my head and buried my face in the fragrant pine needles. The air rang with the agonized screams and the furious buzzing of the flies, and then all sound ceased. When I dared to raise my head, I was alone in the palace. Only the slow ripples extending from the center of the pool indicated that anything had happened at all. The vernal pool was smaller and shallower than when I was a child, only a deep puddle really. It was still the same lush color, and I knew that the water was still, unnaturally warm. I was a little winded after climbing over roots and fighting my way past overgrown branches, and I leaned against the nearest tree to catch my breath. Jenny was in fine form, peering curiously at the pool and running her finger over the papery bark of a dogwood. She turned to me and spoke her first sentence of the day. "Why is the water so green?" I noted the initial stumble and winced inwardly. Jenny had been deeply shaken by the death of Elizabeth's husband a year ago, and while my wife assured me that her daughter harbored no ill will towards me, Jenny kept herself guarded and closed off during our interactions. My memories became spasmodic after Jack's disappearance. I vaguely recall stumbling back through the woods towards my house, stopping at one point to empty my stomach. Some years later, my mother and I about that day, and she filled in some of the gaps. I was crying and ranting, but I mentioned Jack's name enough times for there to be cause for alarm. His body was found shortly thereafter, floating face down in the vernal pool. The police were hesitant to declare the official cause of death a drowning, because both of Jack's eyes had been cleanly plucked from their sockets. I believe there was some sort of investigation, but I don't remember being questioned. My mother also told me that Jack's father killed himself a few months later. The water is covered by a layer of algae and tiny organisms. That's why it's so green, I replied. A lot of different creatures live in bodies of water like this one. Jenny nodded slowly, taking it in, and then wrinkled her nose. It's kinda stinky. This is where the Fairy King lives, I heard myself say. I hadn't uttered that name out loud in over 30 years. He mostly stays hidden away, but he loves gifts. Let me show you. Jenny watched carefully as I found a springy twig, bent it into a circle, and tied it closed with a blade of grass. Then she painstakingly created her own wreath, adding a small white wildflower, which I thought was a nice touch. I watched her busy hands and her brow furrowed in concentration, and recognized myself as a lonely young boy in the quiet intensity of her movements. Ready? I asked. Jenny nodded. We stepped forward together and gently tossed our offerings into the center of the pool. The circlets lay on the surface for a moment, and then sank swiftly underneath the water. He took them! Exclaimed Jenny. She stared intently at the place where the wreaths had disappeared. There was a slight movement in the air, as though something had quietly breathed in and out. The edge of the water retreated slightly, then bubbled forth in a great surge and drew back again, as though waiting. Jenny ran forward before I could stop her and knelt down at the bank of pool. Look, she said. He gave us something back. Something to thank us. I walked over to where she crouched, the mud sucking at my shoes, and stared down at the Fairy King's response. 2 small, perfectly round stones lay in the muck, glistening and blue as the summer sky. They're so pretty, murmured Jenny, handing me one. I held it, warm as blood and a little slimy. It throbbed in my hand, and I wasn't sure if the pulse I felt came from my fingers or from the stone. Jenny went to slip the stone in her pocket, but I stopped her. This is a gift to you, from someone very powerful. You need to remember that. She looked at me solemnly and nodded, and I felt rather than heard a lazy thrumming in the air, as though something were stirring into wakefulness. The air was unbearably still, and it was all around me, the scent of eternal life and of things rotting in the dark.